Welcome, everybody. We're so happy to have you join us. We're just allowing everybody a moment more to come in, but we are so thrilled that you are here to join us. We were just talking about the different experiences of heat across the country, so I hope you're all staying cool. I invite you to introduce yourself in the chat. And I think we're going to go ahead and just get started. We have an ambitious agenda today. So welcome again. I'm Jenny Coleman. I'm the director of Stop It Now. And I'm just so pleased to see all of you joining us today to honor our Founders Award recipient, Joan Tabachnick, and for this exciting panel discussion. And I'm actually really excited to see so many familiar names. And Fran, I'm so glad that you are here as well. Now was founded on hope nearly 32 years ago. Fran Henry, whose vision of a different way of responding to child sexual abuse, and who with her own firsthand knowledge and experience of the complexities of sexual abuse, understood that we need to start with the premise that child sexual abuse is preventable, not inevitable. Her vision inspired a whole new approach to sexual abuse prevention, one that included moving child sexual abuse to a place where we can compassionately and respectfully talk about it and about keeping children safe from sexual harm, taking it out from that shroud of secrecy that fuels abuse and having meaningful conversations that create space for every adult to be an active agent in prevention. Over the years, Stop It Now has grown into a program with services and resources that not only nationally, but also internationally provides people with hope that they can keep a child safe, that they can speak up, that they can take steps to respond when concerned. We've always focused on perpetration prevention, helping those who could be on a journey of harm to get help before they do indeed harm a child. And that hasn't always made us popular or even comprehensible, but we've seen over the years the growing acknowledgement that in order to prevent sexual abuse, we must include those adults and now young people, adolescents, who are seeking help for their own sexual thoughts, feelings, and behaviors towards children. These voices have informed us of the needs and the barriers to getting help, and we've seen firsthand that when someone no longer feels alone, scared, helpless, they're more able to take steps to practice safety planning and stay harm-free. Today, we are indeed a multi-layered, robust program. Our helpline remains the only national helpline where anyone can confidentially reach out for help whenever there is a concern specifically about sexual abuse. We've been the template for Stop It Now programs in the UK, Scotland, Flanders, the Netherlands, Australia, Belgium, and other perpetration programs around the globe. We're particularly proud these days about What's Okay, a new website resource and helpline specifically for youth ages 14 to 22, recognizing the complexities of minors with perhaps sexually problematic behaviors, and certainly with questions about what behaviors are indeed safe or harmful. And we're also thrilled that What's Okay was selected as one of the top promising global perpetration prevention programs for further evaluation and is one of the spotlighted resources on the new Prevention Global Initiative through the Moore Center for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse at Johns Hopkins and the Royal Institute of Mental Health Research. Our signature training, Circles of Safety, has been presented around the world, and we've trained many professionals to bring prevention-focused workshops to their communities, helping folks on the ground working with children and families think beyond just mandated reporting, incarceration, and the sex offender registry as how we prevent abuse. Currently, through CDC Foundation funding and in partnership with USA Football, this training is also being evaluated. And our website is viewed by over 1 million people yearly who download and share our tip sheets and guidebooks and resources. And we remain a participant and leader in conversations with national experts seeking to amplify our voice for hope that child sexual abuse prevention is prioritized and funded. All right, I've done enough bragging. But before I get to the main attraction, I want to acknowledge and thank MASOC, the Massachusetts Society for a World Free of Sexual Harm, working here in our own home state to make sure Massachusetts is providing the best care and support, training, and education to all of those impacted by sexual abuse and sexual violence. We're so pleased to have them partner with us to honor Joan. And for those of you in the audience wondering how to help us continue our vision, we invite you to donate today and know that MASOC and Stop It Now will be sharing your generous gift to support the work we both do. And now, Joan. It is not required to have worked personally with Stop It Now in order to be acknowledged for work that promotes Fran's vision and moves us all closer to seeing a world where children grow up free of sexual harm. But Joan's roots indeed with Stop It Now go way back. As the author and designer of so much that lives on and now today, she has influenced and impacted conversations around the world. I know, here I am honoring Joan but you know what I love about Joan is that she always goes with the flow with me too. And it makes it okay. I've had opportunities to seek her out when I thought I really messed up. And Joan's support and encouragement has kept me and so many others going. As the author and designer of so much at Stop It Now that lives on, she's influenced and impacted conversations everywhere. And as our first staff, there are more initiatives that Joan has originated than I have time to tell you about, but two stand out. Our actual helpline and the Let's Talk guidebook, which she authored and recently helped us revise. And regarding her work in seeing the helpline get off the ground, her concepts, and her involvement in the first call, I love her story that she shares publicly, so I will as well. After the first call from a man looking for help to not sexually abuse a child, she turned and said, "Oh shit, they really will call." We love how real Joan is. Let's Talk was and still groundbreaking, providing people everywhere with a script to begin potentially the most difficult conversation they'll ever have, talking with someone who could be a risk to children and someone they care about. And I'd be remiss if I didn't include her work on the also groundbreaking Dialogue Project, a community interactive conversation inspired by first watching and attending a dialogue between someone who has been sexually abused and a person who had perpetrated sexual abuse. Joan is a partner in so many ways. As a fellowship, in her fellowship with the U.S. Department of Justice SMART Office, she focused on preventing the perpetration of campus sexual misconduct. She's paired with ATSA, NSVRC in individual and collegial publications. Her educational leadership with NERI, her directorship of MASOC, and her ongoing work with STARSA, a science-based treatment, accountability, and risk reduction for sexual assault program, demonstrates Joan's just ability to work well with others. Joan plays well with others. She really is amazing. She is such a valuable resource to any new initiative, to any think tank, to any planning. And she brings people together for a common cause. In fact, that's one of the things she's taught me personally, that no matter what differing perspectives we might have among all of us, we find common ground, most often through the language that we use. And Joan rarely says no when asked for her expertise and help, and we remain truly indebted to Joan as she continues to serve on our advisory board and consults on our own numerous projects. There's so much more to say about Joan's contributions to the world, and now we call her our ambassador, and I call her my mentor and friend, and I hope she knows how much she's influenced not only me, but honestly, the world, making it a better place. Joan, we're so pleased to present you with this award, and thank you so much for all you do to keep us safer and maybe even a little bit saner. So unsurprising to you who know Joan personally, she wanted to avoid an award ceremony with the focus on her and her contributions. So we were able to meet for lunch where we had a lovely low-key award presentation. And instead of a big deal ceremony, she wanted to gift you all with what I'm sure will be an amazing conversation, looking at the landscape of child sexual abuse, with such an amazing group of leaders and experts who know where we've been, where we are, where we still need to go. And Joan will share some thoughts with us first and then share this amazing panel. All of our panelists have and continue to contribute to the conversations, innovations, and practices that bring us closer to our vision of a world where children are not sexually harmed. Together, they have over 200 years of experience. The links for their bios can be found in the chat, and I'm just barely going to introduce them because with their collected accomplishments, I could take the rest of our time together. So with our limited time, I'd rather you hear from them today. So joining Joan in conversation is Karen Baker, retired CEO of Respect Together and founding member of Reliance, Dr. Ryan Shield, an associate professor and researcher, past associate director of the Moore Center for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse, Dr. Tiffany Monfort-Dent, psychologist, expert, lecturer, and consultant on sexual violence, social justice, and culturally informed practices, Dr. Elizabeth Letourneau, professor and director of the Moore Center for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse at Johns Hopkins, David Prescott, director of the Safer Society Continuing Education Center, clinician and author of numerous mental health Bibles, Cordelia Anderson, a pioneer in child sex abuse and exploitation prevention and the founder of the National Coalition to Prevent Child Sex Abuse, and Dr. Jane Silvosky, professor of pediatrics and director of the National Center on the Sexual Behavior of Youth. Thank you all so very much for being here. We've planned for some Q&A following the panel discussion. Please put your questions in the Q&A feature, not in the chat. Then Meg Bossong from MASOC, our new ED at MASOC, will wrap us up with a brief summary. And now, Joan, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Jenny, for these award and for those incredibly kind words. I certainly will try to take that in. And also, thank you for all the really wonderful comments in the chat. And really, thank you, Fran, for letting me be the first, sort of joining Stop It Now as a volunteer in 1992, and then hiring me shortly, thereafter. It was the beginning of an amazing organization, amazing movement, and also the beginning of my career. So I want to say I just really so appreciate people from all over the country, even actually from India, showing up today. And I also especially want to thank my family members who are attending today. It means a lot to me. So thank you. And I also, Jenny, want to say thank you, Jenny, for letting me use this award to do one of my favorite things, which is talking to smart people, some of my favorite people that I've worked with over these past 3 decades, about a hard topic or something that's just not talked about enough, which is preventing the perpetration of child sexual abuse. I want to thank every one of the panel members, Cordelia and Karen, who both came out of retirement to do this, David, Tiffany, Jane, Elizabeth, and Ryan, just for the incredible support and partnership that you have offered over the years, and for some of you, actually many, many, many years. So today's panel questions actually came from conversations that I had with some of you. And the first question is going to be, can you describe one thing about the climate that you were facing when you started your work with child sexual abuse prevention? Because it's hard, I think, for some people who are just entering the field to know, or for those who've been to remember just how far we've come in our work. And the second question we're going to be asking the panel is, what do we need to do next? What is the strategic step that we need to do to prevent the perpetration of child sexual abuse? I think probably everybody on this call can agree on sort of the longer term objectives, like we need, more funding, we need more research, we need a deeper understanding of the wide diversity of children, adolescents, and adults who engage in problematic sexual behavior, and also the importance of reaching families where most of the abuse is perpetrated. But the question is, what is our next strategic one? Is actually in some ways much harder. So we'll get back to that, but because this is my award, Jenny then challenged me to say, well, Joan, you should answer the questions as well. So maybe just say where I entered in 1992, the meme at the time was like breaking the silence around child sexual abuse. And it's hard to imagine that there was absolutely nothing going on TV at that point. There was no special victims unit. There's no movies. There was nothing in the paper. And when people talked about that, they talked about mostly stranger danger. In fact, in 1982, there was a man who made the newspapers because he parked a white van in front of a school and showed how easy it was to lure children into the van by having a puppy there. And that was sort of the concept of how our children are going to be harmed. And so Stop It Now's approach was really radical, starting a program for reaching out to people who are at risk to abuse and to their friends and families. And probably even more radical is that we want to actually talk to the people we want to reach. And so we had a chance, so we wanted to talk to sex offenders in prison. And through Faye Honey Knopp, who is the founder of Safer Society, a truly amazing woman, took us to Dannemora Prison, upstate New York. And it was a chance to talk to people that she had been writing with. And I remember that one man, and his name was Sam, I'm going to say for the sake of this. And I remember the room that we were in. I remember the institutional green walls. I remember the small, like, barred window, up in the corner. And I remember that, we were metal chairs across from the metal table, from Sam. And I remember what he said to us, which was that he's not excusing his behavior by saying this, but that all the signs that he was sexually abusing young boys were there. And nobody asked him, nobody in his circle of friends, nobody in his family, and nobody at work. And he felt like that was tacit permission to sexually abuse. And as shocking as those words were, they actually, I think, have been guiding me for my whole career. And in fact, from those words, we asked, like, what were the signs that people should have seen? And we created the first list of warning signs, not in a child, but what to look for in an adult who might be sexually abusing a child. And over the course of the 30 years, I've found that listening to the voices of people who are affected by child sexual abuse have been so essential. And by doing that, I think we've actually broken the silence, but we've actually done that, but we still need to learn how to talk about it. And Jenny mentioned the Dialogue Project. And what I love is that one of the people on our calls on our Zoom call today was the clinician. We always had what we call a recovering sex offender at the time, but someone who had engaged in sexual harmful behavior, a survivor, and then a clinician. That particular clinician, if you're seeing in the chat, showed up in a trench coat to show that's our concept of it. But what I found was that it modeled how to talk about this. And the questions which inevitably get asked of survivors about why didn't you say something? Why didn't you do something? It's almost like victim blaming. And it was much more powerful for the person who caused harm to say, well, I chose children who were most likely not to say something, and bring the conversation back to prevention. In the same way, the inevitable questions of the person who caused harm to say, like, how many victims do you have? There's really nothing that he could say at that moment, but for the survivor to say, let's listen to these stories so we can learn what we can do to prevent child sexual abuse. So the two conversations together allowed people to stay on prevention and pull people back to prevention. So going to our second question, so 30 years later, I think we now recognize not only that's importance of talking about it, but we also have just more recently, I think in the last decade or so, really focused on preventing the perpetration of child sexual abuse as primary prevention, a chance to prevent sexual harm before a child is harmed. And when I think about what's next, so the three things I wanted to mention was that I've spent most of my career creating education programs and materials, and I've seen that that's so important, but I've seen even more the importance and the power of policy change. And one change, for example, in Massachusetts that has been seismic, which is that we have decriminalized sexual behavior under the age of 12, which means that you can no longer arrest a 10-year-old. So now people are asking, well, what do we do with a 10-year-old? And we shouldn't have arrested them anyway. But along with that question is the shift in attitude, which is so essential to then what Massachusetts has also done is create funding, and they've funded the CACs and trained them to actually work with children who are engaging in problematic sexual behavior. Now, internationally, it is actually age 14. So I think we need to make the shift across the country, certainly state by state, but that we need to think about that kind of seismic policy change. We can make seismic changes. My second piece I want to say, I'm excited to see that many, hopefully all organizations around the country are now taking the time to look at the impact of race, power, and privilege in our work. I know that some of the organizations like ATSA and the National Coalition to Prevent Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation are really taking a deep dive into this. And for me, again, it's been the voices like to see what a difference that can make. And I found that when I had a chance to travel to New Zealand and a chance to hear about a treatment program in the Maori community. And I was so impressed with their ability to hold both respect and accountability. When they described what the treatment program looked like, that to enter into the treatment program, an elder from the community would actually sing an invitation, not just to that individual, but to that individual's ancestors. And in that song, they had to see the impact of what they did, not just on the child who's been harmed, but on everybody else in their family, in that child's family, and in their ancestors. And to actually walk into the marae, which is their holy space, that they had to, by accepting it, they accepted responsibility. And I just have never heard of that level of respect and accountability married together in that same way. So I think that every child sexual abuse or abuse from the organization needs to look at these issues and make those changes. And third, I want to say I still have so much to learn. I mean, I think maybe the piece that keeps me engaged for so long is that each time when I actually have a chance to talk to people about their lived experiences, I learn something. So for example, I recently got a grant from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center to work with two colleagues, Rachel King and Emma Helper, to translate the Stop It Now brochure I wrote 20 years ago into the campus world. And this was the Let's Talk brochure that Jenny mentioned earlier. And it's basically talks about what do you, when you're concerned about someone's behaviors, how do you talk about that? So when we did the focus groups, we heard something that I hadn't heard before, which is guidance about how do I receive that information if someone says that I'm the one who crossed the line. So it is such an aha moment for me because it is so essential that if we know that young people experiment, that young people do make mistakes, what we have not done is give them guidance about how to react. So last, I just want to say that through all of this work, I am really so moved by the people who have shared their stories with me. I am moved by their courage. I am moved by their strength. And I've heard over and over again the need for hope, that the lives will be forever changed, that you can heal as a survivor, or that someone who has caused harm, you can learn to live safe and healthy life. So all of us need to be a part to make that happen. And I think, actually, I'd say I know that the panel today will give you that sense of hope. So I'm really so excited to have everybody with me today. And now I get to do the fun part, which is to start with Cordelia, and then David, and then Karen, is just ask you to describe one thing about the climate or what you were facing when you started your child sexual abuse prevention work. And welcome, Cordelia.
Oh, thank you, Joan. And really, after what you just said, I feel like going back to what I was saying is pretty lame in the perspective of what was going on then. So it's where to start. You know, we were probably fortunate that we did not know what we didn't know. And we were dedicated and we were passionate and we were determined when we got a small grant in 1977 to start a child sexual abuse prevention project in Minnesota in the Hennepin County Attorney's Office. My job was that, and it was also to help prepare children going through court. This was well before CACs. And it was certainly well before we were hearing much else about prevention programs. So we turned to multidisciplinary professionals and advocates, whoever would talk to us about the issue. It was hard to find people to talk about prevention. So our key at that time was really relying on listening to children and talking to parents and teachers. What were their ideas? What were their questions? What had they heard? What language did they use to shape a curriculum and training? What we were up against, Joan said so well, we were up against a dangerous stranger model. We were up against people not believing this was a problem. So why would we invest in preventing it? And for those that did, they didn't want to do anything unless we had a lot of response systems in place afterwards before we tried to prevent it. And there was a lot of fear that we would damage children or scare them if we did anything. There was lack of any evidence or research or specific topics on child sexual abuse in any way at conferences or in organizations, and there's certainly no internet. We worked with Illusion Theater, which was their idea, not mine, to co-write a play to augment the curriculum called Touch. It really helped bring a whole lot of visibility to the issue, to bring parents and children together, community discussions, get us on conference agendas, tour nationwide, get media attention, and get a national federal grant in 1980 that funded 5 prevention programs across the country and get other people thinking about ways to do child sexual abuse prevention. It was radical then. Then what was radical was to talk to children about people they know and trust, and to talk about all our basic lessons that were in that, and the range of touch and so on. But it was also really hard then to get professionals to care about this issue at all. I remember sitting on a panel at a sexuality conference talking about child sexual abuse prevention. The people on it were not very interested in panels. People in the audience weren't. There was one man going, encouraging, and that turned out to be someone interested in researching this topic, which was Dr. David Finkelhor. The people that believe in us around the ways can be transformative when we feel very isolated. We, I think, made so many mistakes when I look back at what we were doing, but we collectively also had a lot of successes. And I think our biggest success is evolution, the evolution understanding the need to focus on preventing perpetration and multiple strategies for prevention. We always knew the value of networking and connecting formally and informally. ASAP was an early group in the country trying to pull together conferences, later the National Coalition, and so many more ways. You know, the reality now just takes my breath away when I listen to Joan and think about who else is on that panel. We are doing so much more in so many ways with restorative and transformative justice efforts to deal with this, to really get more wisdom from those with lived experiences. And we're here to honor Joan, who helped me, along with Stop It Now, to change my framework and to think far more strategically. But that was a mountain of a job for her, because I really go, strategic's not been my strength. So I thank you, Joan. I thank everybody on this panel. And I look forward to hearing other lenses in where we were and where we're going.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cordelia. And I love what you can fit in just 3 minutes. It's really amazing. Thank you. So now I think we're gonna hear from David.
All right. Hey, I get to talk with Joan, and I just got to talk with Cordelia Anderson. It's great to see you, Cordelia. It's all right.
Great to see you.
So I have a bit of imposter syndrome thinking about this because I don't have the right CV to say, here's everything I've done in primary prevention. And I think back to 40 years ago when I started, 40 years ago in 2 months, if I'm to count, and basically nothing existed. And I got a master's in social work, nothing existed. And I did some work in child protective services and nothing existed, just state policies and trying to do the social worker thing back in the mid 80s in Boston. It was really horrific. And I kept watching as the kids I worked with then got swept up into the adult system, into prisons and wherever, and still nothing existed. So after some time, I started working with people who had sexually abused, trying to prevent further offending, tertiary prevention. And if I look back on all of the things that I think I learned over time, it was more about quaternary prevention, that we need to prevent, we need to make sure that we're preventing our interventions from themselves causing harm. And a story that very few people know from a long time ago is that there was this big NIMH grant, and it and a group out in Oregon were responsible for sort of coming together and starting the first ATSA meetings. And so lots of stories around that. But one of the ones that rarely gets told is how one of the main people on the grant started looking at the data that they were getting and saying, oh my gosh, we're focusing in the wrong areas. We need to start moving in the direction of prevention. And it ended up with one person on the grant basically talking the other person in off the ledge, saying, no, you need to finish what you started, and then we'll start figuring out what other kinds of things are possible. And then, fast forward to today, and I guess the place where I see the most hope is that we've got the energy and the spirit and just the wherewithal to keep going with prevention, since it's so difficult. And even here in the beautiful eco-friendly state of Vermont, trying to get public officials to think in terms of preventing harm to the environment is extremely difficult. So I think that's the best summary I could give for now.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, David. And I do appreciate the ending of hope as well, because I think the tenacity that we all have is phenomenal, is by the gray hair on this panel. So Karen, next, you're up next here.
Hello, everybody. It's an honor to step out of retirement to be a part of this prestigious panel. So when I think back to the year that I started in this work was 2000, and I first moved to Pennsylvania to implement the NSVRC. And the thing that comes to mind is I think about the media coverage of sexual violence and how that was shaping perceptions and funding. So first of all, there was just a lot of silence about sexual abuse. When it was mentioned at all, it was frequently confused with domestic violence. There was rarely mention of the great community level work being done by rape crisis centers and others, and a lack of understanding about the fact that they also serve children and men, partly because of the names that they chose. When child sexual abuse was mentioned in the newspapers, it was usually only in the crime section and mostly just reporting on sexual abuse by strangers. There was rarely any mention of resources available or any type of prevention. It was all individually focused. And often those news stories contained language that was victim blaming, and it sometimes even included the victim's name or other identifying information, which caused a lot of problems for those children. And when reviewing overall, looking at those news reports of sexual abuse, it painted a picture of a horrible and inevitable problem committed by individual bad people with no apparent solutions. other than the criminal justice system, or imploring parents to keep an eye on their children around shady-looking strangers. So in addition to this being a wildly incomplete and misleading depiction of child sexual abuse, this picture also did not compel funders or researchers to allocate their scarce resources to support child sexual abuse prevention programs. So I remember in the NSBRC's early work with Berkeley Media Studies Group, they created a talking point that took a lot of people by surprise, and that was prevention is possible, and in fact, it is happening. So we all knew that, but a lot of the general public, that was surprising news. There were many excellent programs thinking about prevention and experimenting with strategies, but we were underfunded and we were often working in silos, not collaborating as much as we are now, or not building on one another's work. So I think several forces contributed to turning this around. One was the CDC's funding of prevention, made possible through the Violence Against Women Act. There was also more research by various groups. Cordelia pulling together the Prevention Coalition was a turning point. Innovative programs like Stop It Now, and just news of all the good work being done by many groups, including those on this panel and in this audience, all made a difference. But honestly, if I had to single out one person who shifted the tide towards prevention, it would be Joan Tabachnick. So congratulations on this well-deserved recognition, Joan.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Karen, Cordelia, and David. I think it's sometimes it's hard to even remember what that was like, 30, 40 years ago, and how much has shifted. And I think, it's David Finkelhor who showed there was a decrease in reported cases of child sexual abuse. And he said that nobody was celebrating that, and we need to find ways of celebrating these shifts and these changes as well. So I don't know if anybody from the panel, the next part of the panel wants to comment, on these really brilliant sort of comments of what we've heard so far, or should we move right into the next one if nobody raises their hand? I've mentioned this could be like Jeopardy. So you could raise your hand first. All right, so we can just go right into there'll be more questions. And please, if people have questions, I mean, this really is like luminaries in my mind of like, in our field. So if you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we will try to get to them when we get to the Q&A portion. So I'll turn this over then to Ryan to talk about like, basically, what would you like our movement to accomplish in the next 3 years, and to continue this important focus on preventing the perpetration of child sexual abuse?
Yeah, so first, thank you so much for asking me to be a part of this panel. I couldn't be more excited to be with everyone. This was a tough question. I've been thinking about this for a while. And so my background is, I'm a criminologist by training, but I work in this shared space of criminology and public health. And one of the enduring challenges is helping people, general population, helping advocates, potential advocates, really visualize what prevention is in action. We know criminal justice. We can picture in our minds courts and jails and prisons and police, and we can see that very easily in our minds. We have a harder time seeing what prevention really looks like in practice. And one thing that's been really exciting is, I think recently, and as Karen mentioned, laying that fantastic framework and foundation of how we talk about abuse and how we talk about prevention, that prevention is possible. And then recently, the sort of explosion of programs, prevention programs, programs being evaluated, the launch of Prevention Global, I think will be really critical in helping us help other people visualize prevention. So I'm one of the co-developers of Help Wanted, which is an online prevention program for young people, young adults who are sexually attracted to children. And we launched it in May of 2020. Since then, we've had like 1 million, and that's not an exaggeration, more than 1 million page visits to our program. And when I talk about Help Wanted, when I give presentations or chat with people just in general public or friends and family, overwhelmingly the reaction is positive. But one of the key themes of the responses I get is people saying, oh, I never thought of that. I never really thought about that population as a group of people we could work with, or I never thought that that would be possible. And so I think being strategic over the next couple of years, humans are storytelling creatures. We're inundated with stories about abuse. I think we need to be strategic about how we develop our stories of prevention and how we talk about those stories and really give people concrete examples, not just at individual level prevention approaches, but then also approaches at the organizational level and within society, shifts in policy. There's really tangible things that we are doing, really helping people kind of see that and see what prevention is.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Ryan. And I have to just say, just for the audience, I've asked everybody to keep their comments at 3 or 4 minutes, and I'm timing, and everybody is just like, to be able to keep all of your work and distill it down to that. I can't remember who it was, but I think it was a famous author who said, I'm sorry I didn't have time to write you a shorter letter. And I feel like you all are just like doing really wonderful jobs. We do have time for Q&A. And so please, if you're in the audience and have some questions for these folks, please, put them in there. And Tiffany, I want to have you come on and join this great panel next.
Thank you. And it's so exciting to be here. Piggybacking on a couple of things that Ryan said, I think definitely I would like to see us more involved in policy. And specifically around funding for prevention. I think we as a society seem to always find money for consequences for punishment, but we seem to struggle to recognize the importance of actually putting in money to support things that keep sexual assault from happening in the first place. And then also how we disseminate our stories about prevention. We know that we're in a world of social media, that we're in a world of ongoing news cycle. And part of it is trying to make sure that our stories, the work that we are doing gets out there, because as we know, a lot of times there's misinformation about what we do. There's misinformation about the ability to engage in prevention work. I think the other piece of it is I'm very much about how do we, specifically because I work with children and adolescents a lot of times, how do we make sure that we are addressing different cultural norms, that we are making sure that the prevention work that we do actually meets the needs of diverse communities. A lot of times our research is based upon people who do not look like a lot of the communities I serve. And so then when we're doing prevention work, we're trying to make sure that we're giving them resources, psychoeducation that does not answer the questions or the themes that we are seeing within those communities. So I really would like to kind of see us begin to do more of that work. And then continued collaboration with an increased collaboration with those organizations whose primary focus is on survivors, because I think we can learn from each other. We are some of the best people to know prevention because we also know what causes things. We are on the other end oftentimes, and being able to collaborate in that education and have support of each other, because I think if our voices are together collectively doing this work, that it's more impactful, and that people don't begin to minimize the work that we do. Definitely ongoing research, encouraging funding of research projects around prevention in diverse communities, as well as what do curricula in terms of psychoeducation look like, but also recognizing that we don't want to manualize everything that we do, because then it doesn't leave room. I also do a lot of work in communities where anytime I'm asked to do resources for Black girls specifically, I'm incorporating things about sexual health. What is normative from a non-cis heteronormative framework, because a lot of our work often comes from how do we work with those who are cisgendered and heterosexual, and does not truly capture the gamut of people and their sexual experiences. And we need to make sure we do more of that.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Tiffany. And I just want people also hear that behind each of these recommendations is just like years of experience and years of sort of really pushing the envelopes for each of the folks here on this panel. So thank you, Tiffany. So Elizabeth, you're up next.
Hi, everybody. Absolutely an honor to be part of this program, and Joan, you deserve every word of praise that you're getting, and then some. I am super excited with where the field is right now and where it's heading. We are in the middle of an explosion of science and development of perpetration prevention programming, development, evaluation, dissemination, adaptation for new countries. We just in the past 5 years is kind of when I date it to, we've seen the development and ongoing evaluations right now, randomized control trials through the roof of self-help programs like Help Wanted, which Ryan mentioned, of helplines, which, you know, Joan was a leader in starting, and which now exist in many countries around the world, evaluations of interventions that include both self-help, but also guided therapist content, curricula for kids to design to prevent the onset of youth problem sexual behavior or its repetition. Jane Slavsky is, I would say, the world's leading scholar in addressing the needs of kids who have already caused harm. You know, our center is involved in, I think, like 12 randomized controlled trial evaluations right now and other types of evaluations, specifically of perpetration prevention. The CDC is funding 9 evaluations. The European Commission is funding, I don't even know how many evaluations, I think 6 that we're advising. It is crazy. It is absolutely amazing. And it's just going to keep growing. What we need to focus on, in addition to continuing to gather the science on what works and what needs work. So that's all of those data are going to be hitting in this year, next year, the year after. Like dozens of trials are going to be contributing data to what works and what needs work. But all of these programs were developed in the global north, have been disseminated in the global north, and particularly in relatively wealthy countries in the global north, and are being evaluated in the global north. You know, Ryan's leading an adaptation of Help Wanted for Mexico, and we've got some other work going on to adapt for some programs for other countries. But when you look at the map, a map of where all of the work is, it's concentrated in North America, it's concentrated in Europe, and it's concentrated in Australia and New Zealand. And there are very large swaths of the world where there's very little happening to prevent harm from occurring in the first place. So that's one thing I want to see happen, and I think it is going to happen, actually. There's folks out there working to make that so. And then, you know, like Tiffany mentioned, and I think we all are very, very familiar with, and Karen and Cordelia also, I think, touched on this, we've got to have stable funding. So the US, you know, we've got some research out there that shows the US spends $5.4 billion every year, 5.4 billion to incarcerate people for sex crimes against children. And in the past 2 years, we've spent each year 3 million on child sexual abuse prevention research. So that's a huge gulf. And, you know, I'm not saying money has to come out of law enforcement or corrections, but I am saying if we can afford 5.4 billion for incarceration, and that doesn't include any of the costs of detection, prosecution, anything, it's just incarceration, then we can certainly, as a country and as a world, put more solid finances and resources into child sexual abuse prevention, including perpetration prevention. The US has started to do that. The US has started to do that. Australia, the UK have started doing that. But not a lot of it is like annual guaranteed funding, like that line item that we now have, that's 3 million, we being the United States, 3 million goes to the CDC. We're trying to get that increased, but there really needs to be a focus on government funding. There are strong movements right now, international movements, to bring in philanthropists and foundations, kind of big pocket philanthropists and foundations into this space. And that's fantastic, but it's going to be government funding that makes or breaks this work. And so that's a place where I think we need to continue pushing, and we need a stronger push. And I could say 10 million more things, but I'm going to stop there.
Well, we'll give you a chance to speak a little bit more, I promise. But thank you, Elizabeth. And you're so right in terms of what we invest in the back end versus if we just took one percentage of that and put that into the front end. You know, so many lives would be forever changed. So absolutely. And I hadn't thought about this, but then I realized in terms of so we're actually having the ending here of 2 researchers. So the next person up is Jane Slavsky, who has done some phenomenal work out in Oklahoma. So welcome, Jane.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenny, for organizing this. And congratulations, Joan, for your vision, your proactive approach to prevention and really raising protective factors and resiliency, not just stopping risk. And wow, what a group. And so honored and blessed to be able to be part of this today. I thought, like Ryan, a lot after the question of 3 years, what's important to focus on and how to really talk about this. I would really like for us to come together and align on our common ground. There's a lot of divisiveness and talking in sound bites that promotes myths. And I think to really make progress, to close the chasm across so many groups, is that we need to join on our commitment to child safety and well-being overall. It's all linked. You know, if you're going to prevent suicide, substance abuse, we're looking at building those protective factors, and we need to join in that common ground and recognize the complexities of situations and families. So that means our solutions have to be multi-layered. There's not a one target thing. If we just do this, it's going to fix it. People aren't bad or good. It's complex. And so a lot of our efforts focus on that individual, primary, secondary, tertiary prevention with the children, and love the need to bring up authentic voices, and want to make a shout out to Gemma Kibben in Australia, who interviewed kids who've had very harmful sexual behavior to find out really what would make the difference. And what they shared is prevent and address my trauma, have honest dialogue around sex education. It's not a nurse talking to me 30 minutes, it's an ongoing conversation. And deal with porn. Deal with the inundation of sexually explicit images, because that's my sex educator if I have no human being to talk to. And so our efforts requires us to integrate the key people in kids' lives. Better lives through better choices is not all on the way to the kids. It's their caregivers, it's extended family, it's teachers, neighbors, faith communities, all of our professions, law enforcement, child welfare, healthcare, librarians, custodial staff. Let's all get on this page and really think about the critical factors to promote sexual health and resilience. It's having trusted adults who are empathetic, nurturing, educational, curious, not judgmental, and really making strides so that they're culturally responsive in the approach. We're asking families to talk about parenting and sex, very sensitive topics. You got to do it in a way that's going to bring them in. I mentioned multi-layered, and so I'm going to go broader. We need to address physical space. We need to address our electronic space. We need to address public policies and agency practices. Currently, there are current public policies in our schools, child protective services, law enforcement, and juvenile justice that inadvertently hinder our families to access treatment that could help. And more so for our Black and brown youth, the systemic racism is causing harm. We're looking at gender differences. There's differences in socioeconomic status that we've got to look at those policies and procedures. States like Massachusetts, North Carolina, New Jersey, North Dakota are looking at their statewide policies, practices, looking at ways to create positive change and make concerted efforts to make those change. We need to make those decisions based on research. Many mentioned David Finkelhor and looking at electronic and sexual exploitation. And those need to inform those prevention efforts and avoid things like only focusing on stranger danger messaging on those platforms. Communities are testing, and Dr. Letourneau talked about lots of wonderful research of trying to test what's going to make it better. And that includes on electronics space. The UK is trying again to try to limit kids' access to sexually exploited materials. We need to test how that rolls out. Is it really going to make a difference? So in order to enhance accurate information for children, caregivers, professionals, we need to interweave and build protective factors, improve access to early intervention, and really transform how we prevent, identify, and respond to problematic sexual behavior of youth. And reiterating, we need to have research guide those decisions and support these. And just to wrap it up, the message that we hear from youth and caregivers in our qualitative research has been, we need to message this is serious and there's hope. Bring them in, this is important, but giving them some guidance and hope. And I probably went over my 3 minutes, I'm sorry.
I would say, Jane, that was fantastic. And like you'll see, there's actually a lot of amens in the chat. So I think that was just phenomenal. It was fantastic. You know, again, the power that each of you bring to this conversation is, and the perspective is just, I mean, it's overwhelming in a really wonderful way. And I know that that you know, there's some questions that are coming in. So I want to have a chance for us to address them. And please, if other people have questions, please put them in the chat. But I think the first one that seems to get a lot of hearts next to it. So I wanted to ask you is that, you know, that, and this is a really difficult one, but like, you know, can you speak about the intersection of racism and prevention? And, you know, certainly you can raise your hands, but I also know that, for example, like, you know, Cordelia, you were really, I think sort of, you know, incredibly, you know, way, like, I don't remember in what year, but you were raising these issues way before anybody else was raising them. And I don't know if you want to get us started and talk about that or that, but given your worldview around prevention and given your commitment around fighting racism, I wonder if you want to get us started with that.
I think, you know, part of that was, again, what we didn't know early on, because I wish I had started with that kind of lens, but it was years into it and a lot of confrontation from a whole lot of people that our work was not adequately in any way, shape, or form incorporating the leadership, the voices, the research, everything. Tiffany, you said, I don't want to repeat it. And I know what Jane was saying. So I think there's so many things, and how we made space for that, how we looked at how our white privilege, for those of us in that space, were getting in the way with that, with funding, with where we were heard, with where our leadership was, where our involvement was. So I think it's an issue that requires us to do personal work. I think, Joan, you remember well when we'd go to certain organizations with this and people would say, this doesn't have anything to do with sexual violence or child sexual abuse. Why do you want us to talk about this? Or why are you suddenly an expert? And it's like, because all of us need to. We need to do our work on privilege. We need to look at the work of our organization. We need to look at where we have silenced other voices, and certainly do a whole lot better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Someone had asked, like, everybody on the panel answer. I don't want to necessarily force everybody to, but I wonder if you know, given that, you know, that each of you have, knowing you, each of you have really addressed this, but Tiffany, you have your hand raised. I'd love to hear your thoughts here.
I think there's a couple of things. I think we know that one of the things when we are even talking about research, right, and we're saying we need to do more research that also incorporates the experiences of communities of color. One of the reasons why we don't engage in research is because of racism, right? Because of how our social work organizations, our psychiatric associations, our psychological associations have done such harm in the narratives and the information, the misinformation that they put out about communities of color, and also being a part of studies and how they have twisted research in order to justify mistreatment of communities of color. So even when we're talking about research and getting those communities to be open to be a part of our studies, we're dealing with that issue. We also know people fund what they care about, and some of that care is who they value. And so when we're even looking at prevention and what are our resources going to look like, and where are we going to put our money into prevention, because we're going to put it in places and with communities that we care about. And those are not communities of color. Those are not poor communities. We usually begin to fund things when they harm wealthier, whiter, suburban folks. And that's when we start saying, yes, let's put that money into it because this is crucial now. And so I think we see that. I think we are more willing to criminalize communities of color when they engage in some of the same behaviors. We adultify children of color, which means that we're more likely, when they're beginning to display behaviors that we need to begin to do some preventative work with, we don't give them the grace and compassion to do so. And we also seem to think that they already know. And so therefore, we don't feel like we need to do prevention or that they deserve to be protected.
Thank you, Tiffany. Does someone else want to jump in as well? Jane, I see your hand up. And David next.
I will amen everything Tiffany said and also try to channel Dr. D. Bigfoot in lessons I've learned from working with her, is how traditional ways of healing and protecting family has been squashed and failed to be recognized, and hindered then how families support healthy development and growing up. And so when we were looking at working with tribal elders and promoting healthy decisions of youth, there were many traditional ways that help support sexual development, good boundaries that were hindered by colonialism, by historical trauma, by boarding school experiences, etc.
Yeah, absolutely, Jane. And I think, and I think what's even harder to sort of like, I know that some of the amazing innovations, like I'm thinking of like Hollow Water at the First Nation in Canada, and that was such a successful program, and then it was just dissolved. Even though it had on every level of research and impact, and it was successful. So it's one of the places where I guess I've seen the most backtracking, and that we haven't seen the same kind of forward movement. David, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to state the obvious, if I could, which is, if you look at the media, you see where so much of this is controversial. But if you look at the data, it's not controversial at all. It continues to flabbergast me that all you have to do is go into Google and look up racial disparities in criminal justice, and you'll have enough reading to do for several years. And then the other thing that maybe they won't say themselves is just looking at, as our field tries to become more just and equitable, et cetera, is how exhausting it is for the people who do this. And so, for this sort of my heroes are Tiffany Dent and Robert Wright in Nova Scotia. When I look at how hard they work at keeping this issue on the table. But I really just wanted to say it is so out there and so obvious. Next steps, please.
Thank you, David. Karen, I know you have your hand raised too.
Well, I was also going to mention the criminal justice system. Like historically, some of our major tools for dealing with child sexual abuse have been the foster care system and the criminal justice system, and they've both done tremendous harm to communities of color. And also when I think about laws, all the laws that are named after children, they're named after white children. So a lot of the very visible things that we do have either been not inclusive or have been actually abusive of people of color. And so we need to do a lot of work to right that ship and to get in front of that for prevention.
Great, thank you. Julia, you have something to add?
Well, I just wanted to mention that many of you know, I think Just Beginnings Collaborative, when that was going, came around when they first started, was trying specifically to fund communities of color and develop leadership in communities of color, and look at that wasn't where the limited funding that was there was going, and to try to bring more visibility to people that were doing the work, very often, very intentionally, in much more culturally specific ways that didn't fit with the ways that many of us were doing our programming or our work and weren't getting the same kind of attention.
Yeah, absolutely. Brian, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, just very, very briefly, I think making sure that we as practitioners do not lose our critical eye, especially if we think, oh, well, we're not maybe doing criminal justice, so we're immune to the trappings of having discriminatory practices. And so keeping that kind of critical self refined, I think, is a really important part of our work going forward.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. This is really, it feels like such an important conversation. And I would, again, it's so rare that we have all these different minds speaking at a topic. I sort of don't want to move on, but I also know there's been some other questions that are coming in. So, so I just also wanted to ask, I think, especially as we move, and I think appreciate, Elizabeth, you were saying how invaluable it is to now finally have research. And but research tends to be sort of in some ways disconnected from the community, or that certain communities actually, are for very good reasons, or maybe are nervous about researchers coming in. And a couple of the questions have really spoken to, what's the best way for, for the average concerned citizen, to help parents and grandparents be aware of sexual abuse and CSAM and extortion and sharing porn. That one of the things I think that tensions we've always had is that we're both a field as well as a movement. And I remember actually Faye Honey-Knapp actually saying at one of the early ATSA conferences, when people were talking about how wonderful it was that ATSA, which is the Association with Treatment and Prevention of Sexual Abuse, how great that we had a journal finally. And then she says, it's like, that's wonderful, but what happens to our social change part of our movement and our work? And so I think there's always this tension. And I'm wondering, just like if some of you want to be able to speak to, how do we continue this as a movement? How do we make sure that the average concerned citizen can feel as involved as the researchers who are getting funding? And just want to if anyone wants to speak to that, or raise your hand on that, or I could call on you too. So careful.
I'll jump in. I'll start. I was just thinking it was one of the things, we've lived in the midst of that tension for so long, and that it is so easy when we finally get all of the more systems and more funding in all of these different ways. As much as we all know we need more, we do really move away, as you said, from what's the social change. Like, are we going to stay invested in really preventing it, or are we going to get locked into continuing to fund what we do? And so I think that the movement part is also, do we have to be a professional, and how much of a professional to do this work? And how do we engage people that this maybe isn't what they live and breathe in their passion, but they do find the ways to the question of, and we do make that really relevant to the role of everyone wanting to have these conversations in their communities, everyone wanting to get involved in the social change, that it is not just up to us as professionals in our different multidisciplinary work, as hard as that is, but to really engage community voices and a very different kind of leadership in the movement and change, that people can indeed do that, are doing that, and that we can learn from each other.
If I may, something else, it may seem small, but one thing that ATSA and MASOC have both done is bring in speakers to talk about how to frame the issues. There's such an art form to how do we discuss this with the public, and how do we get it right? What do we say? What do we not say? Many of us have seen Kelly Socia speak on the topic. Most recently, Suzanne Brown McBride was another one back in the day. There's been many people like that. There's the Frameworks Institute, whose website is really interesting, but so much of it comes back to basic communication skills too, learning how to speak about it, learning how to write, learning how to frame the issues, etc. For me, that's been a major step forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel that you're absolutely, I mean, as you know, how to frame the question, how to frame has been sort of like been maybe one of my favorite sort of areas to think about. And I feel like that's an area that's also, what I love is actually keeps changing. Like how we needed to frame it in 1992 is very different than how we can frame it, today. And I feel like that particularly, I think that the tension to me is a lot of like, oh, it's so easy to frame this in fear, and how do we frame it in hope? And that tension is I think about prevention, if you can't stay with the hope, if you only stay with the fear, then we can't get anywhere. And I what I love about, I think it was actually the Berkeley Media Studies group who talked about, like, if these predators are monsters, then the only way you can stop them is being a superhero. And none of us are superheroes. We're regular people. And so we can start thinking about the people who cause harm as regular people, then we have an opportunity to engage and prevent. And we can't do that if we're staying in that fear section. So Tiffany, I see you have your hand up, so I'd love to hear your thoughts too.
I think one of the things is that as we are kind of developing not just the way we frame the conversation, I think we also need to be more intentional in going into groups that already exist in communities that we have not served well, and begin to have the conversations with them and educate them on how they can kind of incorporate prevention into the work that they do and develop programming that they can utilize. We all know that there are mentoring programs that are already in existence. We know that there are fatherhood initiatives that are already in existence, that there are already these other community groups and community centers that are already there, who oftentimes are just going with what they know. And sometimes it comes from a very lack of knowledge, sometimes as it relates to how we have these conversations, or pulling in some, I know a lot of times I talk about like internalized misogynoir belief systems that then do not help when we're really talking about what does prevention need to look like. So I think some of it is also utilizing those programs that already exist and beginning to educate the people who are running those programs on how, no matter what you're talking about, if you're engaging with young people, if you are engaging, I know like on HBCU campuses, we're doing some stuff now. If you're just engaging with these groups in general, how do you make sure that we're having these conversations about sexual abuse and prevention? And some of that is just basic knowledge around consent and developing healthy belief systems. How do we make sure that we provide them those resources?
Okay, thank you, Tiffany. And Elizabeth, you have your hand up.
Yeah, hey, it's so fun. I have boys, and my youngest is 15 and he's got his first girlfriend, and I was at her house yesterday meeting her parents and talking about how we have, kind of pretty frank discussions with our kids about sex and sexuality, which the mom had brought up, and she said she was kind of chagrined. She's like, yeah, we don't really feel comfortable. We want to, but we're not very comfortable with it. And her husband was nodding his head, yeah. And so I'm going to bring them a book and have a conversation, if they'll let me, with them about talking. And I know all of us do this. I remember learning how much time Ray Knight put into, who's here, his school, I think, parent association board, and really trying to work with schools. And I think each of us does this in our own lives. Like, we each are sort of ambassadors for talking to kids about sex in a way that's open and friendly and hopeful and fun, and all the way up to doing the research with frameworks and trying to figure out how does the country understand child sexual abuse, which has shifted and has also not shifted. I mean, Joan and Karen and some others on this call are involved in a project that we've been working on for several years now. And the public still, by and large, views child sexual abuse as inevitable, not preventable, as a law and order issue, and as an issue for kids to be vigilant about. And we've then tested a bunch of frames to try to shift that. We've got a toolbox of frames that are now going to be coming out that effectively got people to think about this in a different way. But in some ways, we're a long ways away from the 1980s, and in some ways, we're really kind of still there in this respect. So I think going from, the person to person communication with your son's girlfriend's mom and dad, and, maybe your kid's pediatrician, we've all had these conversations, and your schools and all the other ways in which we interact with our own communities, up to putting out toolkits that make it easier for experts to talk about and to frontline providers to talk about child sexual abuse in a way that's accurate and honest and objective, and also contributes to a shared understanding of this as a preventable public health issue. And you would never call it a preventable public health issue because our research also showed nobody knows what public health means. So that was a sad thing for someone who's embedded in the land of public health. And the only other thing I'll say about, how do we work to help parents and educators and pediatricians and counselors and religious advisors and everyone feel a little more comfortable with these topics. We have a lot of good strategies out there. There's things on YouTube, there's books, there's lots of the programs, community for children, committees for children, other groups have got, here's how to talk to your kid about sex, here's how we do this. And then we've got Stop It Now USA with its What's Okay website, which is so wonderful. It's such a fabulous resource. We've got in the UK, they have a program called Shore at the Lucy Faithfull Foundation that's also targeted towards kids and their questions about what's okay. And we're starting to see more and more resources like that, and just making sure those get out to the public is going to be really critical, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. And I think we have time at least for one more question, and one that seems to be popping up also a lot. And I guess maybe just when we comment, I appreciate that, where I think before, again, 30 years ago, there was a real silo between people who worked with victims and people who worked with offenders. And I feel like that became like a semi-permeable membrane, at least, and I think that there is much more collaboration than there ever has been. And I feel like there's also now between sexual health and sort of, that the same that I remember when Deborah Hafner spoke at the MASOC conference, it was the first time that we ever had a keynote speaking about sexual health at our conference. And that was, so I feel like those are ever expanding, and so appreciate that people are commenting on that. So I'm going to skip that particular question and jump to a different one, which is, which really sort of comes from the perspective of, how do we frame and provide training and targeted, and training and targeted specifically for youth, that both staff and adults who may have been abused themselves and now need to engage and support our children and young adults. So the way I sort of understand that question is like, if you, that we know that we need to have these conversations. We also know that we need to have these conversations within families. But when that partly what you're coming to this is with your own survivor experience. So how do we begin to sort of make sure that, and then, how do we engage the children, especially if you have a child who's then maybe acting out or maybe not necessarily engaging in problematic sexual behavior in terms of illegal, but problematic behavior that needs to be addressed. So what advice or what, how do we frame that and provide that kind of training for people who have experienced the sexual violence themselves? And if no one raised their hands on that, I'm going to call on someone. So, I don't know, you can pass, but I would say, Karen, you're kind of the likely person for me to throw it to, but you can pass since I know it's a hard one.
Well, that is a hard one because everyone's experience is so unique, and their the way they experience trauma. But I think in an ideal world, if I'm a parent who's been sexually abused and now I'm talking to my child, I guess I would want some degree of openness, not too many details, but letting your child know that, you've had difficult experiences and here's how it's impacted me. And here's what I wish would have happened at the time. And here's what I wish for you. And by the way, what are you thinking? So just some kind of a connection point. But I know that's really, really difficult. And a lot of people kind of go in the other direction and want to really kind of sweep that under the rug. And I certainly understand that. And that's okay too. But maybe if that's where you are, maybe finding another trusted adult that could have an open conversation. And maybe even saying, this is really a difficult conversation for me. But your Aunt Donna would really love to talk to you about it. Something like that would be my first thought.
Thank you, Karen. And I could say I actually used that particular technique. So, Jane, I know you had a really wonderful comment in the chat. I was wondering if you wanted to just say a little bit more about that.
Sure, it's an incredibly important question. Bill Friedrich's research on children's sexual behavior, sexual development, and problematic sexual behavior. He initially started this work thinking he could identify who has been sexually abused by their problematic sexual behavior, and really researching that link. And one of the things he found was that the rates of child sexual abuse were higher in the mothers than the children with PSB. And so the need to really work on how do you approach the families about this sensitive topic in a way that they can hear and receive it, because it's likely also to be triggering for them for their own experiences. And bouncing on what Karen's saying in terms of respectfully approaching all human beings, that this is an incredibly sensitive topic, and that our life experiences impacts our understandings, and also that we've had traumatic experiences in different ways. I mean, the likelihood is the adults you're talking to have had traumatic experiences around that. So if we make an assumption that this is going to be seen and heard through a lens of your own trauma, and talking about how can we make this a safe space for you to address this, allows that to be part of how they're then receiving the information and approaching the children in their lives.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane, and Karen. Is there something else want to thought, I think this is, as Jane, you said, this is something that every family, there's somebody in each of our families who will be wrestling with this. And I think sort of opening the space within families to have those conversations, whether, and not, I guess I would add, not necessarily even start from the adult to child, but also making sure the adults to adults are having those conversations, so that when you do need to have the conversation with the child, it's been normalized in some ways in your household. And for those who have children, know that the kids are always listening to our conversations anyway, in ways that we don't know. So beginning to model that allows them to begin those conversations. There's some also wonderful resources in the chat, and and maybe just to, what I guess maybe just like one sort of last question I think that is just like, is that because there is such a important connection between working in the field of sort of sexual abuse as well as sexual health, and that's something I feel like we are just uncovering now. And one of the that if people have some thoughts that they would want to offer the audience about what are some of the next things that we do to sort of like, in a country, at least I can say that all of us are in the US, and the country that doesn't want to talk about sexual health, that in fact it's easier to talk about sexual abuse than it is to talk about sexual health. How do we begin to to do that, because that's such an essential element of prevention. So wonder if anyone wants to take that one on. Karen and Ryan.
Just a quick thought. I think, although this will be painful, I think we should all show up at our local school boards regularly and weigh in on things like book banning, et cetera, and start there.
Love that, Karen. And Ryan.
And I would just add, I think it's okay to acknowledge that, when we're giving presentations, we can talk about maybe how some folks might find it uncomfortable, but it's okay, because I'm here to help you through it. Like, kind of approach the topic in an inclusive way. Like, yeah, we might not feel comfortable about this, but let's work together. Let's kind of wrestle with these ideas together. Kind of make it a group activity where you're leading the conversation.
I love that. Thank you. I also know that I promised to turn this over to Meg by 3:20, and it's 3:19. So I want to use this last minute to just say, thank you. I feel like this is like, I'm not a sports person, but like, I know that people talk about the dream team, and I just feel like, oh my God, I got my dream team here. So I can't play sports. I have no idea what this number of people would be in a sports team. Probably wiffle ball is the best I can do. But I just want to say thank you all for giving your time, for willingness to say, to say yes to this, and to sharing the wisdom that each of you bring to the table. It really, this is, yeah, this could not be a better day for me. So thank you. And I'm gonna turn this over to Meg now.
Great, amazing. Okay, thank you all so much. I am just sitting here a little starstruck because I'm seeing so many people who have been so foundational in my own learning and in my own career, and the people who I cite on my slides, and it's really incredible to see all of you. And Joan asked me to kind of tie up with a few bows the conversation that we've had here. And the first is that I just want to echo the incredible gratitude that has been flowing through the chat for Joan. I myself came up through the rape crisis movement and field, and Joan transformed my experience of thinking about prevention, and so generously invited me into this field and this community of practice and this tent of the movement. And it has been just such a generative and amazing experience. And so I just want to echo the deep gratitude that's flowing through the chat. And I know that Julie and Dylan will save that for you, Joan, so that you can read that later. So a few things that I heard flow through, and one is about I was thinking while folks were talking about this quote by Amita Swadin, who I think a lot of people know, who's an organizer and thinker on issues of survivorship and sexual violence prevention, and part of Just Beginnings Collaborative and many other groups. But they have talked about the wisdom that goes beyond my own experience. And you all have spoken about the power of bringing into conversation people who have done harm, and the absolute essential role of that, of making sure that we are deeply understanding that harm actually ripples in a lot of directions. It ripples into those folks who are responsible for that harm and their families and the people who love them and the systems that surround those individuals, and that any kind of conversation about response or prevention is incomplete without that wisdom. And so that was a through line that I heard from everyone. And I think thinking about what Elizabeth was saying about randomized controlled trials, and also what folks were offering around the wisdom from Indigenous communities, is thinking about the whole picture of evidence, of RCTs and experiential evidence and contextual evidence and generational wisdom that comes through communities, and figuring out how to genuinely incorporate that into our scholarship, into our funding models, into our policy, because I think that begins to weave in justice and equity in a way that we really need, and provides, again, a more structural view of wisdom that folks were really calling in as being critical and essential to our work. I also heard this through thread around technology, and I don't think, I know, having heard all of you talk and all of you work, that no one here thinks that technology causes child sexual abuse, that it is something that has been happening for a really long time, but thinking creatively and adding an ethic about how we think about the pace and format of technological development, and just trying to really bring ourselves into conversation with all of the different arenas, where everything from generative AI to devices to the role of technology in youth is really, really critical, and linking arms in partnership with other fields that we perhaps have not worked with before. I know that when I was in academia, it was so easy to go over to women's gender and sexuality studies or sociology, and to link arms with those academic departments, but thinking too about computer science and entrepreneurship and all of the programs that are deeply tied to the quick escalator of technology without an ethic behind it. And thinking also about the way that technology atomizes us is a real challenge, that so many of us were speaking about the essential need to show up at our school committee, to be on the school committee, which is an even more daunting prospect, right? I saw folks saying in the chat that they're on the subcommittees for their children's schools, and technology has a way of really atomizing us and pulling us away from that collective work, but it's deeply, deeply important. Then also I heard folks talking about and Joan, you've been such a critical part of this, the abundance mindset that is really critical to this work, that there is enough compassion, there is enough resourcing, there is enough brilliance, there is enough for us to think about survivorship and harm in the way that it really needs to be thought of. And that, Joan, you have really been so essential in spreading that abundance mindset across a lot of different fields and a lot of different movements. And we have such deep gratitude for that. And with that in mind, Julie does keep putting the donation link in the chat. So I do just want to concretely think about an abundance mindset in this particular moment. And then I saw several other folks who are here who have been really involved in thinking about restorative and transformative justice and the role of imagination and creativity and work in systems and work in structures really has a way of stealing our imagination about what is possible and reconnecting with creativity and reconnecting with thinking about, okay, what does this next season of work look like for us? What does in what ways can we be creative about taking all of what we have learned and heard from one another and learned and heard from different communities and to keep bringing to bear that these systems were created, and actually in looking at our historical perspectives, they're not that old, which means that we can create other systems, we can create other structures, we can create other policies for that. And finding that kind of stream of creativity is really essential to our ongoing work. And insisting also on investment from our government all the way from federal to local levels, insisting that indeed we need to fund prevention as relentlessly and rigorously as we are seemingly willing to fund policing, for instance. And, you know, I was listening to the really rich conversation, really textured conversation around race and power and privilege. And one of the things that jumped out to me was thinking about I was thinking about what David said about it's so obvious, like the literature is so obvious and the imbalance in the funding is so deeply obvious between, you know, prevention and what we spend other things on. And I think that it calls us to think and talk about in what ways sexual violence is politically useful. And sexual violence has been politically useful through the entire history of this country. It was useful to propping up chattel slavery. It has been useful to the cultural and literal genocide of Native communities in this country. And there are ways that it is politically useful now. And really digging into the way that prevention of sexual violence is linked to broader collective liberation, I think, is the key to breaking down the political utility of the role that sexual violence has in our communities, and it's deeply essential. Mariam Kaba, who's a thinker and an organizer and has incredible books about transformative justice and justice for young people, has a quote that I actually have tattooed on my inner forearm that says, "Hope is a discipline." And what she's explained that by saying is that hope is not a feeling, it's not a nebulous sort of future thing that we think about, that it is a daily practice. It's the product of collective labor. It's the product of doing our best thinking and our best work and our best struggle together, even when sometimes we are in tension with one another around ancillary issues to that. And this group, I think, has spoken so eloquently about that. And then the last thing that I wanted to note, because it is absolutely visible, I think, to everyone who's worked with Joan and everyone who's worked with this group of people over decades, is the really essential role of joy in this work. That You don't create a decades-long career and be able to be in deep relationship with other people who do this work without a really critical element of joy. And the ability to laugh together and the ability to just appreciate everyone's professional and personal growth and everyone's gifts that they bring to this work is really deep and sustaining. And so that is the thing that I think is also the underlying thread of all of this work. And so thank you for letting us witness that.
Meg, thank you. I'm jumping in just in the last 30 seconds, just because I want to thank everyone, and not just this amazing panel, and not just you, Joan, but as I look in the audience, as I know you have, we have such an amazing representation of other leaders, experts, collaborators, partners, innovators in this audience. I wish I could name them all. I hope you all are as inspired and moved as I have been through this. I've been to so many webinars and conferences as you have. I'm sorry, this was like, to me, the cream of the crop. Thank you all so much. And Joan, I want to just leave you with Sujatha had to jump off, and she wants you to take the chat, soak in a nice tub with a quiet cup of tea, and soak in how loved you are. Thank you, everybody. Have a peaceful, wonderful rest of your day. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.